teen refuses to help elderly man at gas station until he sees his dog tags. Alex Ford had never known anything other than the town of Fairview. Nestled in the heart of suburban America, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. A place where the scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air during summer, where kids rode their bikes down quiet streets in the early evening, and where every face was familiar. This was home to Alex, a place where nothing ever really changed, and that was exactly how he liked it. Life in Fairview was simple. And for a teenager like Alex, who found comfort in routine, simple was good enough. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now let's continue. He'd spent all of his 15 years in this town. The rhythms of small-town life were ingrained in him, almost like a beat he couldn't escape even if he wanted to. Alex had never questioned the life he led, his school, his friends, his family. Everything just fit. Sure, there were occasional thoughts about what might be out there beyond the familiar borders of Fairview, but those thoughts were fleeting. The day-to-day didn't leave room for much else. After school, Alex would go to soccer practice, sometimes meet his friends afterward to grab pizza at Mama's or play video games until his eyes burned. His life had a cadence, a comfortable predictability that filled up his time. Most days, he hardly noticed the small details that others might, like the way the sun set over the parking lot at the high school or the deep red hues of autumn creeping over the trees in the neighborhood park. It was as though he was living in a world of autopilot, existing in a rhythm that didn't require much effort or attention. And for the most part, he didn't mind. His parents, both hardworking professionals, were busy with their jobs. His dad worked long hours in a tech startup in the city, and his mom was a lawyer who often brought work home. Alex had grown used to being left to his own devices, which was fine by him. He had friends, a comfortable life, and the future seemed far enough away not to worry about it. One particular Saturday, Alex's world followed its usual script. He woke up late, spent a few hours on his phone, and then dragged himself to soccer practice. The sun was bright that afternoon, casting long, warm rays over the field as the team ran drills. Afterward, his coach shouted something about needing more focus, but Alex was barely listening. His mind was already elsewhere, thinking about the pizza he was going to get with his friends, and how he might finally be able to finish the level of his favorite video game that had been giving him trouble for days. The whole town was quiet that afternoon, quiet in the way small towns could be. It was a slow, languid kind of day, where time seemed to stretch and settle in, unwilling to be rushed. Alex had a sense of satisfaction, of peace. Even though he didn't understand it fully, there was something comforting about the humdrum of it all. It didn't matter that life outside Fairview seemed to bustle with energy. This place, with its predictable rhythms, felt safe. After practice, Alex stopped at the gas station on his way home. It was one of those small, independent stations that had been around forever, its faded red and white signs a landmark in the town. The gas station wasn't much to look at, but Alex had stopped here countless times before, always at the same time, always for the same reason. He had to fill up his car. His mom had bought him the old sedan for his 16th birthday, a used model that smelled faintly of smoke and spilled soda. It wasn't the kind of car anyone would call cool, but Alex didn't care. It was his. As he pulled in, he noticed the usual cast of characters. Old Mr. Jenkins was filling his truck up, giving Alex a nod as he passed by. There was Carla behind the counter, as always, busy with her crossword puzzle. But something else caught Alex's attention, something that seemed out of place. An elderly man was standing near the entrance of the station, his thin frame hunched slightly, his face lined with deep wrinkles. He was staring down at the ground, his hands stuffed into the pockets of a threadbare coat. For a moment, Alex barely registered the man's presence. He wasn't unusual in the sense that Fairview was full of older people, some retired, some still working. The elderly came and went, their faces familiar in the way they had always been. But this man, Alex realized, seemed different. He was standing there, not doing anything in particular, just existing in the space between the gas station and the rest of the world. His demeanor was that of someone who didn't quite belong, as though he had stepped out of another time or perhaps had been forgotten by the world around him. Alex quickly turned his attention back to the task at hand. He needed to get gas. The last thing he needed was to talk to a stranger, especially one who seemed like he had nothing better to do than stand around. Alex had been in his comfort zone for so long that he'd started to avoid anything that might disturb it. He didn't need to get involved in anyone else's problems, didn't need the interruption of unfamiliar faces. He had his own stuff to think about. The trip to the gas station was just one more box to check off in his mundane Saturday schedule. As he pumped the gas, he caught sight of the man again, this time closer. The old man seemed to be watching him, but his gaze wasn't demanding or forceful. It was more like an invitation, or perhaps a plea, to connect. Alex quickly glanced away, uncomfortable. He didn't want to feel like he owed anyone anything. He just wanted to get back in his car, head home, and forget about whatever was bothering the old man. The last thing Alex wanted was to get involved in something that would disrupt the easy flow of his life. But then the man approached him, slowly, with that same quiet determination in his step. His eyes locked onto Alex's, and for a moment, Alex felt a flicker of hesitation, a strange unease that he couldn't quite explain. The old man cleared his throat, his voice raspy, as if it hadn't been used much. "Excuse me, young man," he said, his words slow but clear. "Could you give me a hand?" Alex froze for a second, his hand still gripping the nozzle. He wasn't sure what the man needed or what he even wanted. His instinct was to turn away, to ignore the request, to simply finish up and drive off. It was a Saturday afternoon. He didn't want to be bothered. But something about the old man's voice stopped him. It wasn't a demanding voice. It wasn't even a sad one. It was just tired. Alex cleared his throat and looked at the old man, unsure of what to say. What do you need help with?" His voice felt foreign to him, like he was trying to force himself into a role he didn't feel comfortable in. The man's eyes softened for a moment. "I'm just trying to get my bags into the car," he said, gesturing to a small cart by his side, filled with what looked like dog food and a few other items. "My legs don't work like they used to. Could you help me carry them?" The request seemed simple enough. And yet, Alex felt a strange resistance within him. He didn't want to help. He wasn't in the mood. He barely knew the man, and it wasn't as though Alex had any special fondness for old people or those in need. Life in Fairview was full of people asking for help, but Alex had learned over time that most of them were either looking for charity or an excuse to make you feel guilty. He wasn't going to fall for that. I'm kind of in a rush," Alex muttered, looking away. His voice sounded weak even to his own ears, but he was too proud to back down now. Besides, he had plans, friends were waiting for him, and there was no way he was going to spend a Saturday doing charity work. He wasn't even sure what this man wanted. What if it was just a trap? What if he was asking for money, or worse, attention? The old man seemed to sense Alex's discomfort. He nodded slowly, his face settling into an expression of quiet resignation. "That's all right, son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sure someone else will help me." And just like that, Alex felt something he couldn't quite name, something sharp and bitter in his chest. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. It was more like a question, something unspoken that lingered in the air between them. He looked at the man, at the bags of dog food, at his tired eyes, and then at the car waiting for him. And for a fleeting second, Alex wondered if he had made the right choice. But before he could act on that feeling, the old man turned away, shuffling back toward his truck. And Alex, with a sense of relief he didn't entirely understand, climbed into his own car and drove off, back into the world he knew, back into his comfort zone. The day after meeting Harold, Alex couldn't shake the strange unease that had settled deep within him. It was a feeling he didn't know how to name, but it had gnawed at him for hours, like a small crack in the perfect shell of his comfortable, predictable life. He woke up to the hum of his phone alarm, the usual sound of the weekend signaling the start of another ordinary Saturday. But as he went through his usual routine, showering, making a quick breakfast, grabbing his backpack for the day's plans, the unease lingered, trailing him like a shadow he couldn't escape. It wasn't that Alex disliked his life. In fact, he had everything most teens would want: a decent car, enough friends to feel like he belonged, a solid academic record, and the security of knowing exactly what each day would bring. Fairview was the kind of place where life felt like a well-worn pair of sneakers, familiar, comfortable, and never too tight. But somewhere, deep in his subconscious, Alex had started to question whether this was all there was. He didn't even know what he was looking for, but there was a nagging, persistent feeling that things weren't quite as they should be. It was an odd realization. After all, Alex's world was so small, so straightforward. What could he possibly want more of? He had everything he needed. Friends, soccer practice, video games. His parents were busy, but they were present when they could be. Even though his dad had been traveling a lot for work lately, Alex didn't mind. He never really had to answer to anyone, and his mom, though often buried in her case files and client meetings, had always made sure he was well taken care of. His life was easy, and he was used to it that way. He liked the structure, the security. What else was there? And yet, there was this longing, something elusive, like a far-off dream that Alex couldn't quite reach. It wasn't that he wanted to escape Fairview or reject his life, but rather that there was an internal sense of dissatisfaction, a feeling that there was something more, something bigger waiting for him, but he couldn't put his finger on it. It was a craving for something outside the bubble, something that had depth and meaning. But what could that possibly be? As he sat down to breakfast that morning, the thought of Harold kept creeping into his mind. The old man with the dog. Harold had seemed so out of place, yet oddly familiar. He wasn't just some random stranger asking for help. Alex knew that much. There was something in the way Harold had spoken, his slow, deliberate words, as if he wasn't just requesting a favor, but rather reaching out for connection. And Alex, for reasons he didn't understand, had refused to help him. The thought of Harold's eyes, the way they had softened when he'd asked for assistance, lingered with Alex throughout the morning. It wasn't just that Alex had been dismissive. It was the way he had felt in the moment. Too busy, too self-absorbed, too comfortable in his own life to give a second thought to an elderly man struggling with something as mundane as a bag of dog food. Harold had made no demand. There had been no pleading. But still, Alex had turned away, and the shame he now felt was strangely heavier than he expected. It wasn't that Alex thought helping people was unimportant. He'd been taught to be kind, to do good when he could. But helping a stranger was different, especially one who seemed so far removed from his world. Harold had no connections in Fairview, no roots in the high school system, no mutual friends. He was just an old man, fading into the background. So, why did it matter? Why was Alex still thinking about him? What was it about that brief encounter that had affected him so deeply? Alex tried to ignore the guilt and shift his thoughts to the more pressing matters at hand. He had plans to meet his friends later at the park for a pickup game of soccer. They'd grab lunch afterward, and then maybe they'd play some video games at Brandon's house. It was the same routine every weekend, and it felt comfortable, like putting on an old jacket that fit just right. But for some reason, that sense of security felt less satisfying today. He couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to step outside of that comfort zone. Maybe it was the feeling of being stuck, the realization that he had been living the same day over and over again, without any real change, without any real purpose. He had been thinking about the future more than usual lately, what he was going to do after high school, where he wanted to go to college. But those thoughts always seemed distant, theoretical, like a set of goals that belonged to someone else. The truth was, he had no idea what he wanted to do with his life. And maybe, deep down, that was the root of the discomfort. He was trapped in a cycle of routine, unsure of how to break out of it. It wasn't that he disliked his life, it was just that it lacked excitement, novelty. He couldn't remember the last time he felt truly challenged by anything. Everything seemed predictable, almost scripted. It was a Saturday afternoon when it finally hit him. He was sitting in his car, parked outside the fast food joint where he and his friends usually met for lunch. The sun was shining through the trees, the air was crisp and fresh, and yet, as he stared blankly out the window, he felt disconnected from everything around him. That's when the thought came, unbidden but unmistakable. I need to do something different. The realization startled him. It wasn't a loud epiphany or a grand revelation, but it was there, quietly, pressing against the edges of his mind. He needed to break free, not from Fairview, not from his friends, but from the feeling that life was moving on without him. He needed something that would push him, make him feel like he was part of something bigger than himself. Alex didn't know what that something was yet, but he felt the desire to find out. He wanted to see more, experience more. He wanted to know what else was out there. Maybe helping someone like Harold wasn't just about feeling good. Maybe it was about connecting to something deeper. Maybe it was about stepping outside his comfortable, predictable life and seeing the world in a different way. That evening, as he sat in front of the TV playing video games with his friends, the thought didn't leave him. He thought about Harold again, about the sadness in his eyes and how he had offered no expectation, no ulterior motive, just the simple request for help. Alex realized that in avoiding the situation, in rejecting the chance to make a difference, he had kept himself safely entrenched in his comfort zone. But deep down, he knew that safety wasn't the same as fulfillment. He wanted more than to just exist, more than to just coast along, doing what was expected of him. He had always taken the easy road, the one where everything seemed to align perfectly, where there was little risk, no real challenge. But the older he got, the more restless he felt. He didn't want to look back one day and realize he had never stepped out of his small circle, never tested the limits of who he could be. He wanted to be someone who could make a difference, even in small ways. And maybe helping Harold was the first step in discovering what that might mean. As Alex lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of his thoughts settled on him. He wasn't sure how to change or what the future would hold, but he knew one thing. He was ready for something more. He was tired of living life on autopilot, tired of the predictability of his own existence. The next morning, Alex woke up with a newfound sense of clarity. He wasn't sure what it was going to take to break out of his routine, but he was willing to find out. He realized that by helping someone else, he might not only make a difference in their life, but also in his own. For the first time in a long while, Alex felt like he was standing on the edge of something unknown, something exciting. And for the first time, he was ready to step forward. The next few days after Alex's encounter with Harold at the gas station felt like a slow burn. The weight of that brief, awkward interaction lingered with him like a phantom, an unwelcome guest that refused to leave his mind. The idea of stepping out of his comfortable bubble, of doing something different, had taken root deep within him. He could no longer ignore it. It gnawed at him, reminding him that something in his life had been left undone, an unspoken opportunity that he hadn't seized. The notion of making a change, however small, became an itch he couldn't scratch by going through his usual routine. And so, he knew he had to act. For the next couple of days, Alex's life continued in its usual rhythm. He went to school, hung out with his friends, and played soccer, but all the while, he was silently wrestling with the idea that things had to change. And yet, what exactly was he supposed to change? He didn't have a clear answer. It wasn't like he could just wake up one day and decide to live a completely different life. He was 15 years old, still figuring out who he was, still trying to make sense of the world around him. But that sense of dissatisfaction, that pull to break free, continued to grow. Something inside him kept whispering that he needed to take action. He needed to help someone, to do something, to make a difference, no matter how small. Alex's chance came sooner than he expected. It was Thursday evening, and Alex was at the local diner with his friends, Brandon, Mia, and Sophie. They were seated in a corner booth, laughing and talking over burgers and milkshakes, but Alex wasn't fully present. His mind kept wandering to Harold and his dog. For reasons he couldn't explain, the image of Harold, thin, stooped, looking out into the distance, kept flashing in front of his eyes. The old man's vulnerability had stuck with him, and for the first time, Alex realized that it wasn't just about helping someone. It was about confronting his own fears of stepping out of his comfort zone. It was about doing something real, something meaningful. After dinner, as they were all getting ready to leave, Sophie mentioned something about a dog shelter nearby that needed volunteers. "My mom told me they're looking for people to help out on weekends. She said they're always short-staffed," she said, as she grabbed her coat. "Anyone want to come by Saturday?" Brandon immediately scoffed. "I'm not hanging around a bunch of yappy dogs all day. Not my idea of fun." He grabbed his hat and headed toward the door, but Sophie just shrugged and smiled, unfazed. Alex, on the other hand, paused. He didn't know why, but the mention of the dog shelter struck a chord in him. A dog shelter. It felt like a sign. Suddenly, his discomfort with helping strangers, especially elderly strangers like Harold, seemed even more ridiculous. Maybe this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Maybe this was how he could make up for what he hadn't done. "I'll go," Alex said before he had a chance to think it through. The words slipped out almost without his permission. His friends looked at him in surprise. "Really?" Mia raised an eyebrow. "I thought you hated anything that didn't involve video games or soccer." "I guess I could give it a shot," Alex shrugged, trying to sound casual, even though his heart was beating faster now. This was real. This was the unfamiliar situation he had been yearning for, but had been too scared to embrace. "I'll come by Saturday." Sophie smiled. "Great. They're looking for help with cleaning and walking the dogs. It's not glamorous, but it's something." Saturday morning arrived with an almost unnatural amount of anticipation hanging in the air. Alex couldn't quite explain it, but the thought of volunteering at the shelter had taken on importance that seemed out of proportion. It felt like the first step toward breaking free from everything that had held him back. The world outside Fairview, outside his circle of comfort, beckoned him, and for the first time, he was willing to listen. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew it was a step in the right direction. Sophie picked him up at 9 a.m., her car filled with the warm smell of coffee. "You ready for this?" she asked, glancing at him with a grin. Alex hesitated, feeling a slight pang of doubt creep up, but he pushed it down. "Yeah, let's do it." The dog shelter was located on the outskirts of Fairview, near a field that stretched for miles. It was a small, humble facility, nestled in a quiet corner of town where people rarely ventured. As Sophie drove down the long gravel road that led to the shelter, Alex could feel the excitement building. The trees on either side of the road seemed to sway in rhythm with his nervous heartbeat. The world outside his window was unfamiliar, and he had to admit, there was something exhilarating about it. The shelter itself was a modest, two-story building with a large fenced-in yard where several dogs were playing. As they pulled into the lot, Alex saw the dogs running in circles, barking excitedly at the sight of new people. It was a chaotic, loud place, but there was something undeniably joyful about the energy there. Sophie led him inside, where an older woman greeted them. She had gray hair pulled back into a messy ponytail and a warm, welcoming smile. "You must be Sophie," she said, her voice warm and kind. "You brought someone new with you today?" Her gaze shifted to Alex, and she gave him a smile that felt like a genuine invitation into this world. "Yeah, this is Alex," Sophie said, her tone light. "He's here to help." "Wonderful. We could use all the hands we can get. I'm Mary, by the way." She looked at Alex, as though she could tell he was nervous. "Don't worry, it's not too complicated. We need help with cleaning the kennels and walking the dogs. You up for that?" Alex nodded, trying to hide the jittery feeling in his stomach. "Yeah, sounds easy enough." "Good. The first thing we're gonna do is clean the kennels. Don't worry, it's just some sweeping and scrubbing. We need to make sure the dogs are all set for the day." Mary handed him a mop and a bucket, and without missing a beat, she led him toward the back, where the kennels were. Sophie followed close behind, and as they passed the dogs, Alex felt a mix of excitement and nerves. He had never spent much time with animals outside of his own pet goldfish, and even then, he wasn't the most attentive owner. This was new territory. As they worked, Mary gave them tips on cleaning the kennels, instructing them on the best way to scrub the floors and change the bedding. At first, Alex felt out of place, awkward, unsure of how to move, unsure of the rules. But then, as the minutes passed, he started to feel more comfortable. The dogs weren't so scary. They were just animals, friendly and energetic, wagging their tails as they watched the humans with eager eyes. Some of them followed them around as they cleaned, pressing their noses against the fence, their excitement palpable. Alex found himself smiling as he bent down to pet one particularly excitable dog, a golden retriever named Daisy. Her fur was soft, and when Alex scratched behind her ears, She flopped onto her back, rolling over in delight. It was as though the whole atmosphere had changed in that moment. The nervousness that had accompanied Alex when he walked in had started to evaporate. The dogs, their simple, joyful presence, had a way of grounding him in the here and now. They weren't judging him. They weren't asking for anything beyond attention, affection. And in return, Alex felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of peace. But the real shift happened when it was time to walk the dogs. As Mary handed Alex the leash to Daisy, she smiled. "You seem to be getting the hang of things."
"Y hora natural."
Alex blinked, surprised by the compliment. "I'm just walking her," he said, a little embarrassed.
"No, it's more than that."
"It's about giving them the love and care they need, especially when no one else is around." Mary's words struck him with a sense of clarity. It wasn't just about doing something new, it was about doing it well, doing it with purpose. And in that moment, walking Daisy through the open field, Alex realized something. It wasn't just about helping Harold. It was about being present for others, giving his time and energy without expecting anything in return. He had been so wrapped up in his own world, his own comfort, that he had forgotten how much there was to offer beyond his little bubble. Helping at the shelter, walking the dogs, feeling the connection between himself and the animals, it was all part of something bigger than himself. It was a step toward living with more intention. As Alex looked at Daisy, wagging her tail happily beside him, he understood, finally, that stepping outside of his comfort zone wasn't about throwing everything away. It was about embracing what was unfamiliar, trusting the unknown, and finding joy in the simple acts of kindness. The first few hours at the dog shelter felt like a whirlwind. Alex had expected a simple, straightforward day, sweeping, mopping, walking dogs. But the reality of it was far more demanding than he anticipated. When he first arrived, he had felt that familiar rush of nervous energy, that tightness in his chest. It wasn't the dogs themselves that made him uneasy. They were friendly enough, eager for attention, their tails wagging like flags of unconditional affection. No, it was the sheer unpredictability of the task. The shelter was much busier than he'd imagined, and the work was more labor-intensive than he had expected. The kennel cleaning routine, for example, was much harder than it sounded. They had to scrub down the floors and wipe down the walls of the pens, rinse the bedding, and replace the food and water dishes, all while the dogs barked and clamored at the gates. It wasn't the kind of work that allowed for a moment of rest. Alex found himself bending over, knees aching, the constant scrubbing making his hands sore. At one point, he accidentally knocked over a bucket of water, splashing the floor and his jeans in the process. He had to scramble to clean up the mess, feeling embarrassed and frustrated with himself. The dogs, of course, were oblivious to his struggles, as if their only concern was the next walk or the next treat. Sophie, who had been helping him with the cleaning tasks, looked over and laughed when she saw the water spill. "Don't worry," she said, her tone light. "It happens to everyone the first time." But Alex couldn't shake the sense of inadequacy. He had never realized how much work was required to run a place like this. He had been expecting something simpler, just a couple of quick tasks and a few walks, and then he could go home. But this was real work, work that required patience and endurance. There was no escape from the mess, no chance to take a break until the job was done. By the time it was time for the afternoon walk, Alex was already tired. His muscles ached from bending, sweeping, and scrubbing. His back was sore from leaning over too many kennels. The sun outside had climbed higher in the sky, and the heat made the shelter's small yard feel like a sauna. Even the dogs seemed to be wilting in the heat. But there was still work to do, and he couldn't back out now. It was at this point that Alex's feelings of discomfort began to evolve into something deeper, frustration. He had thought volunteering would be easy, but now he was beginning to understand that helping out wasn't just about doing something good, it was about facing the discomfort of hard work. And in the process, he was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about the dogs. It was about pushing himself through a challenge he hadn't anticipated. This was a test not just of his physical endurance, but of his ability to embrace discomfort and work through it. The first dog Alex was given to walk was a large, excitable German shepherd named Max. Max was jumping and pulling at his leash from the moment they stepped outside. He's a little high energy, Mary had warned him when she handed him the leash. But don't let him drag you around. He'll listen if you stand firm. At first, Alex was doing fine. He was able to control Max with just a little tug on the leash, guiding him away from the other dogs and toward the field at the edge of the shelter. But Max wasn't just excited. He was untrained. He lunged in every direction, trying to dart toward every distraction. A butterfly fluttering by, a rustling in the grass, the sound of other dogs barking from the shelter. Alex struggled to keep up, his arms aching as he tried to maintain control. With each tug on the leash, he felt his own patience fray just a little bit more. "Come on, Max," Alex muttered under his breath, trying to regain control. But the dog was relentless. Every time Alex managed to get Max walking at a steady pace, the dog would dart off again. And soon, Alex found himself out of breath, feeling foolish as he stumbled over uneven ground. Max, of course, was having the time of his life, oblivious to Alex's growing frustration. This continued for what felt like an eternity. Max seemed to sense Alex's frustration and responded by pulling even harder. Alex was tired, his legs already sore from the cleaning, and now his patience was wearing thin. The further they went into the field, the more distracted Max became. It was a constant battle, one tug of war after another. Alex could feel his face flushing with irritation. Just when Alex was on the verge of losing his temper, something unexpected happened. Max suddenly stopped. His ears perked up. He sniffed the air, then began walking calmly, keeping pace with Alex. It wasn't that Max had become an obedient dog in the blink of an eye. No, the dog still had his own mind and his own agenda. But for that brief moment, he had become attuned to Alex's energy. The moment of calm that passed between them felt like a breakthrough. Alex took a deep breath, realizing something. It wasn't about dominating the dog. It wasn't about forcing him into submission. It was about establishing a rhythm with him, a subtle understanding. It was the same with life. Sometimes you had to slow down, find a rhythm, and adapt to what was happening around you instead of trying to control everything. He adjusted his grip on the leash and let Max lead a little more. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, matching the dog's pace. Slowly, as if in response to Alex's change in approach, Max stopped pulling and settled into a steady walk. Alex felt the tension in his body ease, and by the time they made it back to the shelter, he was actually enjoying the walk. Max, too, seemed to have calmed, his exuberance tempered by a newfound respect for Alex's presence. As Alex led Max back to the kennel, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. It hadn't been easy. In fact, it had been one of the most frustrating experiences of his life. But he had pushed through it. And in doing so, he had learned something important, not just about walking a dog, but about how to approach challenges in life. Later, when he met up with Sophie and the others, he was surprised to find that the work at the shelter had become less daunting. The kennels were still a mess. The dogs still needed walking. But Alex was no longer overwhelmed. He had learned how to pace himself. He had learned how to manage his frustration, how to let go of his expectations, and accept that things wouldn't always go according to plan. As the day wound down, and he sat with Sophie on the bench outside the shelter, sipping from a bottle of water, Alex realized something important. This experience wasn't just about helping the dogs. It was about discovering a strength he hadn't known he had. He had been so comfortable in his routine, so safe in his world of predictability, that he had never really tested himself. But now, through the unexpected challenges of the shelter, he was beginning to see that there was more to life than comfort. There was value in hard work, in perseverance, and in stepping outside of one's own limitations. Sophie looked over at him, wiping sweat from her brow. "So, how'd you like it?" she asked, her tone teasing but gentle. Alex took a deep breath, feeling a sense of satisfaction that went beyond just the physical exertion of the day. "I liked it," he said, simply nodding. "It was tough, but I think I'm getting the hang of it." Sophie smiled. "You'll do great. You've got more patience than you think." For the first time in a long while, Alex didn't feel like a teenager trying to find his way. He felt like someone who had just completed a challenge, someone who had faced discomfort head-on and come out stronger. And though the journey ahead was still uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer afraid of stepping outside of his comfort zone. By the third weekend of volunteering at the dog shelter, Alex had settled into a rhythm. The physical discomfort of cleaning kennels, the mental strain of walking excitable dogs like Max, and the unpredictable chaos of managing the shelter's daily activities had all become routine. It wasn't easy, and it still wasn't always fun, but it was something. It was a responsibility, a sense of purpose he had never really experienced before. The dogs, the shelter, and the people he worked with had all become part of his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. His confidence had grown, and the sense of achievement after a hard day's work felt like a victory in itself. But now, as the weeks passed, Alex began to notice something he hadn't expected. Despite the sense of accomplishment, despite the satisfaction of checking off tasks and feeling like he was making a difference, there was a gnawing emptiness underneath it all. He'd helped dogs find temporary shelter, had walked them, cleaned up after them, and spent hours with them. But each time he came home, the feeling of fulfillment was fleeting. It didn't stay with him the way he thought it would. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch, a hollow victory. One Saturday, after a particularly long day at the shelter, Alex found himself walking home alone. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the streets of Fairview. The day had been exhausting. He had scrubbed kennel floors until his knees were sore, taken Max for a walk that felt like an endurance test, and spent an hour washing dogs in the back of the shelter. But when it was all said and done, he felt drained, not in a productive way, but in a way that made him wonder if he was really making a difference at all. He had expected that helping out at the shelter would feel like a transformative experience. He thought it would give him the sense of purpose he had been missing in his life. But now, as he walked home through the quiet streets, Alex found himself questioning whether this was the change he had been looking for. It wasn't that the shelter work didn't matter. He knew it did. The dogs needed help, and the shelter was a place that offered them a safe haven. But there was something about it that felt unsatisfying, like he was just checking off boxes on a list without actually changing anything fundamental in his life. The discomfort he had felt at the beginning, the nervousness, the fear of doing something new, had all faded. He had adapted to the routine. But now, in the calm after the storm of his initial struggle, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to life than just going through the motions. As he passed the gas station where he had first met Harold, the memory of the elderly man came flooding back to him. Harold's tired eyes, his rough hands, the way he had hesitated before asking for help, it all resurfaced. For some reason, that interaction had stayed with him. At first, Alex had brushed it off as a random encounter, something that didn't really matter. But now, he was beginning to wonder, what if it was supposed to matter? Alex reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, unlocking it and scrolling through his messages. Nothing new. He checked the time. He still had a few hours before he was expected back at the shelter for another shift. He could go home, rest, maybe play some video games to unwind. But the thought of retreating into his usual distractions felt more hollow than usual. He couldn't ignore the question that was nagging at the back of his mind. What was he really accomplishing? He walked to the park and sat on one of the benches, the cool breeze ruffling his hair. Alex had always preferred being alone, finding solace in his quiet, solitary routines. But as the minutes passed, his mind kept returning to Harold. The old man had asked for help that Alex had refused to give. Sure, he had been uncomfortable, and it had been easier to walk away than face the uncertainty of stepping outside his bubble. But now, that refusal seemed more like a missed opportunity. He could have helped. He should have helped. Alex felt a deep sense of regret, but he didn't know how to fix it. He had already made up his mind in that moment at the gas station, and now, it seemed like it was too late to change it. Harold was probably long gone by now, and he didn't even know where the old man lived. He couldn't just go back to the gas station and ask if anyone had seen him. It wasn't like he had made any kind of promise. And yet, there was this persistent feeling, this underlying dissatisfaction that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about Harold. It was about his own failure to do something meaningful, to truly make a difference in someone's life. The volunteer work at the shelter was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. He had convinced himself that it was enough, that it was a way to be a good person, to step out of his comfort zone. But now, in the quiet of the park, he was realizing that helping a few dogs wasn't the same as really helping someone. It wasn't the same as making a human connection, as doing something that had a deeper impact. As the day wore on, Alex found himself walking back to the shelter, the weight of his thoughts heavy on his shoulders. The usual buzz of activity at the shelter seemed almost meaningless now. Dogs were barking, volunteers were cleaning, and Mary was handing out tasks, but to Alex, it all felt like busy work. He was doing the right things. He was checking the boxes. But nothing about it felt truly fulfilling anymore. He tried to push the thoughts away as he walked back into the shelter. Sophie was there talking to a couple of other volunteers, and she waved when she saw him. "Hey, you're just in time. We got a couple of new dogs coming in today. Are you up for it?" Alex nodded, though his heart was. And in it. He knew what to expect, more walking, more cleaning, more of the same. But something had shifted in him, something he couldn't quite put into words. As he helped bring the new dogs into their kennels, he realized that he didn't feel as attached to the task as he had in the past. His mind kept drifting back to the idea of helping Harold. What would it take for him to feel like he was truly making a difference in the world? The dog shelter was a good cause, and he genuinely cared about the animals. But was it enough? Was it enough to fill the emptiness he was feeling? By the end of his shift, Alex was exhausted. His body ached, but the physical fatigue wasn't what was weighing on him. It was something deeper, a feeling of disconnection. As he packed up his things, ready to head home, he was hit with the realization that the help he had offered to the dogs, the shelter, and the community hadn't really changed anything for him. It hadn't filled the void he had been trying to fill. He had expected to find purpose in this work, but instead, he found himself searching for something more real. Sophie noticed his quiet mood as they walked out together. "You okay?" she asked, glancing at him sideways. Alex nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was lying to her or to himself.
Yeah.
"Just tired." "Yeah, it's a lot of work," she agreed. "But you're doing a good thing, you know? I'm proud of you for sticking with it." Alex appreciated her support, but he knew it wasn't enough. It wasn't that he wasn't grateful for the shelter, for the opportunity to make a difference. It was just that it felt like a half measure. It felt like something was still missing, something that couldn't be fixed by walking dogs or cleaning kennels. He wanted to do more, something real, something that mattered not just in the grand scheme of things, but in the immediate, everyday reality of people's lives. That night, as he lay in bed, Alex couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to Harold, to the missed opportunity, to the way he had turned away from someone who needed help. He could have done something. He could have made a difference. But he hadn't. And now, as he replayed the moment over and over in his head, he realized that he wasn't just disappointed in Harold for asking for help. He was disappointed in himself for not stepping up when it mattered. The next morning, Alex made a decision. He wasn't going to keep letting this feeling of emptiness linger. He wasn't going to let another opportunity slip through his fingers. He wasn't sure what exactly he was going to do about Harold. He didn't even know where to start. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to wait around for life to give him more chances. He was going to go out there and find a way to help, even if it meant facing the discomfort of stepping into the unknown once again. The following week, Alex found himself standing in front of the gas station where it had all started, the place where Harold had asked for his help and where Alex had turned away. He had been walking past this spot every day on his way home from the shelter, always avoiding it, always letting the memories of that moment linger like a bruise he couldn't quite heal. But today, for reasons he couldn't fully understand, he felt compelled to stop. It wasn't a conscious decision. He hadn't planned to confront it like this. The moment simply arrived uninvited, and he was left with no choice but to face it. As he stood on the sidewalk, the familiar scent of gasoline and rubber filled the air. Cars hummed in the background, and the usual bustle of the station continued around him, but the world felt oddly distant. Alex's heart beat heavily in his chest as he glanced around, half expecting to see Harold shuffling through the parking lot, asking for help once more. But of course, Harold wasn't here. Alex had no idea where the man had gone after that encounter. And yet, the guilt gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. He took a deep breath, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans. He hadn't really thought about what he would do if Harold did show up. He just knew he needed to do something, anything, that might begin to repair the wrong he'd done. For the first time in days, Alex's thoughts shifted away from the routine of shelter work, away from the dogs, and even from the hollow victories he'd tried to fill his life with. This was bigger. This was about doing the right thing, about being a person who didn't just go through the motions but actively made a difference, even if it meant confronting the mistakes he had made along the way. Just as Alex was about to turn away, his phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the tension. He pulled it out and saw that it was a text from Sophie. "Hey, I heard you've been walking past the gas station a lot lately. You doing okay?" Alex stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. He couldn't hide the truth anymore. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that he was still content with his role at the shelter. He'd spent too long lying to himself, pretending that volunteering was the answer to his dissatisfaction. Now, it felt like he was standing at a crossroads, unsure which direction to take. "I think I need to make things right," Alex typed, hesitating before hitting send. "I messed up a while ago. I turned away someone who needed help. I think I need to fix that." He waited for Sophie's response. The message felt raw, like an admission he had kept buried for too long. When the reply came, Sophie's words were simple but reassuring. "You don't have to do it alone. You'll figure it out." Alex smiled faintly at the screen, feeling a small sense of comfort in her words. Sophie, as always, had a way of grounding him. But this wasn't about Sophie. This was about him. This was about taking responsibility for the things he had done and failed to do. He took another step forward, glancing at the gas station doors. A sense of nervousness crept in, and for a moment, Alex wondered if he should turn back. What was he really expecting to find here? Was there any way to undo what had happened? "You've got to do something," he muttered to himself, the words feeling like an unspoken mantra. With no clear plan in mind, Alex pushed through the door of the station. The bell above it chimed as he stepped inside, the familiar cool air of the convenience store surrounding him. It wasn't much, a few shelves stocked with snacks, drinks, and cigarettes. A small counter at the back with a cashier working on a crossword puzzle. But Alex couldn't shake the feeling that this place held a moment in time he couldn't erase. He scanned the aisles, half expecting Harold to materialize out of nowhere. "Can I help you with something?" the cashier asked, looking up from her puzzle. Alex paused, his thoughts scattered. "I'm just looking for someone," he said, his voice hesitant. "An older man. Harold. Do you know him?" The cashier's expression softened, though she seemed puzzled. "I haven't seen him in a while. He used to come in here a lot, but I haven't heard from him in weeks." Alex felt a sinking sensation in his chest. He had hoped there would be an easy answer, some way to reach Harold, but the emptiness of the response left him feeling more lost than ever. He thanked the cashier quietly and stepped back outside. It was then that the weight of his actions hit him harder than ever. There was no magical resolution, no quick fix. Alex had made a choice weeks ago, a choice to walk away from someone who needed help. And now, no matter how much he wanted to, there was no way to undo it. Harold was gone, and Alex had missed his chance. He stood there for a long moment, staring out into the street. The wind had picked up, swirling autumn leaves around his feet. There was a strange sense of finality in the air, as if the world was reminding him that some opportunities, once past, were gone forever. Alex closed his eyes, trying to collect his thoughts. What did it mean to make things right? Was it about apologizing to Harold, even if he never saw the man again? Was it about finding a new way to help others? Was it about forgiving himself? In the end, Alex realized that there was no single answer. The truth was far more complex. Making things right wasn't about one single act of redemption. It was about the effort, the willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them. It was about facing his discomfort and understanding that the road to change was messy, uncertain, and often painful. For the next few days, Alex kept thinking about Harold. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. The regret didn't go away. It simmered beneath the surface, a constant reminder of his failure. But with that regret came clarity. Clarity that he needed to do more, that the work at the shelter wasn't enough, that his understanding of what it meant to help others had been too narrow. He needed to be more present in the world, more willing to step up when people needed him, regardless of the discomfort it caused him. The next Saturday, Alex found himself in a local diner, sitting at a booth near the window. It was a quiet morning, the place mostly empty except for a few elderly patrons sipping coffee and chatting softly. He had come here for one reason: to try and find Harold. He had no idea where the old man might be, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to try again. Just as Alex was about to leave, the bell over the door jingled, and in walked an older man with a weathered face and tired eyes. Alex's heart skipped a beat. It was Harold. Harold shuffled past the counter, his gaze distant, his steps slow and deliberate. Alex hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach the man, but then he stood up, walking toward him with a sense of resolve. He couldn't undo the past, but he could still do something now. "Excuse me," Alex said, his voice steady but nervous. "Harold?" The man turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as if trying to place the name. "I remember you," Harold said, his voice rough but not unfriendly. "You're the boy from the gas station." Alex swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the words. "I'm sorry for what happened that day. I should have helped you. I messed up, and I want to make it right." Harold studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he spoke again. "I get it, kid. Life's complicated. But you came back. That's what counts." Alex exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "I know I can't change what happened, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry." Harold smiled faintly. "You've learned something. That's all anyone can ask for. Maybe that's all the right thing there is to do." In that moment, Alex realized something profound. The redemption he had been seeking wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic fixes. It was about taking responsibility, learning from his mistakes, and making a choice to be better from that point forward. As he sat down to talk with Harold over coffee, Alex understood that the price for making things right wasn't about undoing past mistakes. It was about moving forward, learning to be present, and taking the necessary steps to make a difference, however small. It had been a few weeks since Alex's encounter with Harold in the diner. In that time, things had changed, not in grand, obvious ways, but in the quiet, subtle shifts that marked growth. The satisfaction he had once sought through the dog shelter work and the idea of doing something good for others now felt less urgent. The dogs were still a priority. He still cared about them, about their well-being, but the sense of doing the right thing had taken on a new dimension. In the days following his conversation with Harold, Alex found himself thinking more and more about what it meant to help others. It wasn't about the external acts, the tasks, the completion of duties. It wasn't about earning accolades or feeling like he had checked the right boxes. It was about being present, about truly being there for someone when they needed it. It was about seeing another person's humanity, understanding their struggle, and recognizing that, even if you couldn't change everything, you could still make a difference in small, meaningful ways. The conversations with Harold had stayed with him, how the older man had told him that it wasn't about making things perfect. It was about acknowledging that life was messy and complicated, and that sometimes redemption didn't look the way you thought it would. Sometimes, redemption was simply showing up, owning your mistakes, and striving to be better, even when it seemed like too much. Alex had learned a lot from those moments of reflection, but it didn't make the journey easier. In fact, it made it harder. Each day, he was faced with the weight of what he had once ignored. The casual, self-absorbed life he had lived before felt so distant now, so shallow. He couldn't go back to that place of comfortable indifference. The life he had known before, the one where he lived in his own bubble, checked out from anything that seemed too difficult or too complex, no longer felt right. The shifts were gradual. There was no dramatic aha moment, no overwhelming surge of clarity. Instead, it was more like peeling back layers of a protective shield, one piece at a time. Alex spent more time at the shelter, but it wasn't the same. He had stopped seeing the work as a form of personal achievement. It was no longer about him. It was about the dogs, about the volunteers, about the people who came to adopt. It was about connection, not accomplishment. One afternoon, after a long walk with Max, the same dog from the shelter who had become his companion through thick and thin, Alex found himself sitting on the park bench, watching the leaves drift lazily in the autumn breeze. He had spent hours with the dogs that day, taking care of the ones who had just come in, giving them some time outside to stretch their legs. But as he sat there, he felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. He had been trying so hard to do what was right, trying to fix his mistakes, but it wasn't working in the way he had imagined. He still felt like there was something more, something deeper, that he hadn't unlocked yet. It wasn't just about helping animals. It wasn't just about helping people. It was about him, about who he was becoming in the process. Max, ever the loyal companion, sat beside him, resting his head on Alex's knee, looking up with soft, understanding eyes. Alex scratched behind the dog's ears, taking comfort in the simplicity of their bond. There were no expectations, no judgments. Max didn't care whether Alex had made mistakes in the past or whether he was still trying to figure things out. He simply cared that Alex was there in that moment with him. That thought settled in Alex's mind, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something that had been missing for a long time. Peace. Not the fleeting, superficial kind of peace that came from achieving things, from ticking off boxes and hitting goals. It was a deeper peace, a peace that came from accepting where he was, from understanding that the journey itself was what mattered, not the destination. Alex's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He looked down and saw a message from Sophie. "Hey, I was thinking about you. How are things going with the dogs?" Alex smiled to himself, feeling the weight of her words. Sophie had always been supportive, always encouraging him to keep going even when things got tough. He thought about the times they had talked, the way she had been a grounding force in his life. Sophie had always been there, even when he hadn't realized he needed her. "It's going well," he typed back. "I'm getting a lot out of it. But it's different now. I think I'm figuring out what it's really all about." He paused before hitting send, thinking carefully. He wanted to be honest. He wanted to share this newfound sense of clarity, this understanding that had emerged from the fog of his earlier confusion. It's not about doing good things anymore. It's about being there for the right reasons when it matters. Helping without needing anything in return. Showing up, even when it's hard. "It's not about me." He pressed send, feeling a small but significant shift in himself. There had been a time when he would have brushed off these thoughts, kept them to himself, never willing to confront the vulnerability of truly being open about his feelings. But not anymore. Sophie's reply came quickly. "That sounds like real growth, Alex. I'm proud of you. You've come a long way." Alex felt a warmth spread through him at her words, a sense of gratitude that made his heart lighter. It wasn't just about volunteering at the shelter, or about how many dogs he had helped find homes. It was about this moment, the moment when he realized that true fulfillment wasn't something that could be quantified. It wasn't about external validation or applause. It was about being true to yourself, about connecting with others in a meaningful way, about stepping up when it counted, even when the path wasn't clear. The next day, Alex found himself back at the gas station, standing in front of the same spot where he had once turned away from Harold. It felt different this time. He felt different. There was no guilt lingering in the back of his mind. There was no sense of failure or regret. He had faced those feelings, acknowledged them, and let them go. He had made mistakes, yes, but that didn't define who he was. What mattered now was how he chose to move forward. As he stood there, he saw a familiar figure in the distance. It was Harold. The old man was walking slowly toward the station, leaning heavily on a cane, his gait unsteady but purposeful. Alex's heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, he started walking toward him. "Harold," Alex called, his voice tentative but sincere. Harold stopped, squinting at Alex through the morning light. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by a small smile. Well, Harold said, his voice gravelly but warm. "You came back." Alex nodded, feeling a mix of emotions surge through him. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability he felt. "I shouldn't have turned away. I'm sorry for that." Harold waved his hand dismissively. No need for apologies, kid. Life's too short for all that. But it's good to see you again. You've got a good heart, I can see that. Alex smiled, feeling a sense of relief he hadn't expected. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, he said quietly. And I think I finally understand what you meant. It's not about making everything perfect. It's just about doing what you can when you can. Harold nodded thoughtfully.
Exactly.
You're a good kid. Don't get too hung up on what you can't fix. Just do your best, and that's all anyone can ask for. Alex stood there for a moment, absorbing the wisdom in Harold's words. There was no need for grand gestures, no need to make up for every mistake. What mattered was that Alex had shown up, he had taken responsibility, and more importantly, he had learned. He had grown. As they talked, Alex felt a deep sense of peace settle within him. The need for validation, for external markers of success, had faded. What mattered now was the quiet contentment of being true to himself. There would still be challenges, of course. There would still be moments of doubt and confusion. But he knew now that true growth came not from avoiding mistakes, but from learning to embrace them and moving forward with humility and purpose. With a final handshake, Harold shuffled off toward the station, and Alex watched him go, his heart full. For the first time in a long time, Alex felt that he was on the right path, not because everything was perfect, but because he had come to terms with the imperfections. And that was more than enough.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.